From our archives, the Billy Graham Classics.
Now tonight, I want you to turn with me to the 11th verse of Jude. Jude is a little book tucked away in the back of the Bible. And there are just a few verses, and this is just a phrase from one verse. And here's what it says. Woe unto them, for they have gone the way of Cain. Woe unto them, for they have gone the way of Cain. Now that's a strange expression, the way of Cain. And yet when I pick up the Bible, I find an interesting thing, that there are only two ways of life in the whole Bible. One is the way of Cain, and the other is the way of his brother Abel. Abel was accepted by God, and Cain was rejected by God. So there's the way of Abel, and there's the way of Cain. And tonight I want to talk about these two brothers, because they were the first children in the history of the human race. God had created Adam and Eve, and they had two children, their first two children, Cain and Abel. And we find brothers all the way through the Bible, like Jacob and Esau, and Moses and Aaron, and Absalom and Amnon, James and John, Peter and Andrew, Joseph and his brethren. And in the first or the fourth chapter of Genesis, you'll find the story, the fascinating, challenging, thrilling, tragic story of Cain and Abel. You see, they were the first children born. They were the first farmers. They performed the first religious ceremony. And they had the first quarrel and the first act of violence that was ever done on this planet was done by Cain against his brother when he killed his brother in a fit of anger because of jealousy and envy. But Adam and Eve must have been excited when these boys came along, because Eve said, I've gotten a man from the Lord. You see, Adam and Eve had just come through a terrible experience. They had rebelled against God in the Garden of Eden. Now, in the Garden of Eden, where they lived, there had never been a war. There were no armies. There were no police. They didn't need them. There were no jails. There was no poverty. There was no suffering. It was a marvelous world to live in. And they rebelled against God. And God drove them out of paradise, drove them out of the Garden of Eden. And it says a very interesting thing at the end of the third chapter of Genesis, so they wouldn't touch the tree of life. Why? If man had eaten of the tree of life, he would have lived forever in his sins. In that sense, death is a blessing to the human race. Suppose Hitler lived forever. Suppose people like Stalin and Eichmann lived forever and plagued the human race. But one generation passes and another comes. It's constantly changing and shifting. God drove them out so they wouldn't eat of that tree of life and live forever in their sins. But God also promised, before he drove them out, God promised that someday he would send a Redeemer. And he illustrated it by going out and slaying some animals and shedding blood and clothing Adam and Eve in skins. And God